All right, so for those of you not sure if this is for you and if you want to tackle building your own course, this is going to give you a great overview of the process. For those of you that are committed, it's a good idea to understand from beginning to end what this entire process is going to look like so you know where things are done and what to expect. Because in certain parts of this, you're probably going to be wondering, when am I going to be adding my pins? What about my tees? Where's my grass? When does that stuff happen? So this is going to give you a very, very, very high level overview of the design building process. So as I talk you through this at a high level, we're going to talk about terrains and imagery, which is the basis for the entire process. And then we're going to talk about splining, which is adding the, if you want to call it, the golf physical assets, the tees, the greens, all the stuff that make a golf course a golf course. Then we're going to talk about taking those terrains, that imagery and the splines that you created, and how you combine them together. In other words, laying your splines on your terrain. And then we make it into a game, which is we have a gaming platform called Unity, which we use to kind of combine it all together. And then you export it out of Unity into GSPro. And then lastly, you publish your course for others to play. That last one is completely optional. You can build this and just play it yourself. You do not need to publish it for the entire community to play. It's perfectly fine. But if your desire is to publish it, you should know there are some requirements and some minimal expectations for you to do that. We'll get into that a little bit later, but we'll cover it at a high level here. So first of all, let's talk about terrain and imagery. So the first thing, when you think about a golf course and what makes a golf course or the most famous golf courses, what makes them what they are, it is really the terrain. How the hills roll. Is it on a mountain? Is it, is it at the bottom of a valley? What's it? How do the greens slope? Where are the tees in relation to the fairway? Where's the fairway in relation to the green? And in the upper left corner here, I have a representation of what we call a terrain. A terrain is just data, we also call it a height map, on what the elevation data is like on your course. And that is it. It is just data. It is nothing really about, is this a fairway? Is this a green? Is this a lake? Is this a road? It is just the elevation data, okay? And that is the key piece of building any course. Without that data, it's really hard to build a course. Now, you can get that data in two different ways. One is called LiDAR, and LiDAR is laser, I think it stands for laser radar. At a high level, what happens is they fly planes over the land and they can get very accurate, detailed elevation data, and then they put it into files. In the US, they publish that for free. Other countries, you might need to pay for that data. Some places, it's simply not available in your SOL. If you do not have LiDAR data, you can create terrains, and there are things out there you can do to create the terrains. It is, I'm going to tell you right now, I do not recommend it for your first course. It is a lot of extra work. So at a minimum for your first course, I would recommend you find some place that has LiDAR data. The second thing is, and you see it in the right-hand side here, is an overhead satellite image, and the one you're looking at here is a Google image. Bing also has them as well. And that gives you a bird's eye look down on your course, and how it's laid out so that you can take that information, that satellite image, and you can start to lay it over top of your terrain. And eventually we're going to marry those two together. Okay, so understand that we need some terrain, which is going to come from LiDAR, and we're going to need some imagery, and we're going to need to overlay those each other, and that's what we call a satellite overlay on top of our terrain so they can see how our course relates to our terrain. So once we have that terrain and imagery, what we're going to do is what we call splining. And we do that in a program called Inkscape, where we take our satellite image and we start to trace out the golf course specific attributes of that image. And you can see here things like fairways, bunkers, greens, tee boxes, cart paths, um, lakes, streams. And you can get an idea if you look down at this, what those are. You can pretty much, if you know a golf course, this is a golf course, and you can see the fairways and the various things. And then we can also mark the power of GS Pros. We can also mark other areas in there that you might want to customize. And you see the area in pink here, which is like a wooded area on this particular course. But we can mark just about anything we want, anything that we want to identify in game as a separate, if you want to call it, landing area that has certain attributes like a rough, a deep rough, a fairway, and how that ball is going to react when it hits these particular areas. But for the purpose of this, you just need to know that we're splining here and we're tracing out the various aspects of the course. And we do that inside of Inkscape. Once you have your spline done, what we do is we take that terrain data that we got earlier, that height map, we take the spline data that we just created, and we use a tool called Blender, which is a fantastic name, and blend those two together. And we essentially, it's like taking paper and wrapping around an object. So we can form it. So our splines are the paper, and our terrain is that object. And we use Blender to essentially take a 2D object, which is our splines, and turn it into a thing called a mesh, which is a 3D object. Think of it now as a piece of paper that has been moved and put into waves, and now it conforms into that terrain and it begins to take shape. It's a little hard to tell in this picture, but if you look closely, you can see that there are valleys in there now, and things have now been wrapped around that terrain. You can see where those streams are, that it goes down a little bit. Same thing with the water areas. You see in blue, they go down a little bit where that water is going to sit. Okay. Again, that's what we call a tool called Blender, and the output of that is a file that we can pull into Unity. Okay. Actually, it's multiple files, what we call, we'll get into this later, but they're called FBXs. Those are objects that we pull into a program called Unity. Unity is where you're going to spend the vast majority of your time. It is a game editor. So when you play something on Xbox and PlayStation or on a computer, you have game engines that game publishers use to make those games. And in this case, we use a game engine called Unity. So GSPro runs Unity, and then us, this group as course designers, we use the Unity editor to do that. So after you created that terrain, after you created those splines, you created, and then you created your meshes in Blender, all those meshes are brought into Unity where we can start to manipulate them and assign materials to them like grass. We can plant trees in there. We can put tees in there. We can add objects like buildings, but that is all done inside of Unity. You will spend well over half of your time building a course inside of Unity. So it's probably one of the platforms you really need to get used to the most. After you build everything in Unity, we have our trees in there, our grasses, and we essentially at that point have a thing that looks and feels like a golf course. We're ready to start finishing things up, and a few things happen at the end. One is at the very end, we add our out of bounds, our tees, our pins, and our hazards in a tool we call Greenkeeper. Believe it or not, that is not done inside of Unity. It is a specific tool that we use to add all those things. And you're thinking, well, I can't believe you don't do that in Unity. Well, it's something that's very specific to GSPro. So the publishers, the developers of GSPro created a tool specifically for us that it takes a Unity game object that we created with all of our trees and our meshes. We pull it into Greenkeeper and we add that out of bounds, that tees, the pins and their hazards, and then it creates a file that can be read inside of the GSPro game that adds those objects. Greenkeeper and actually not Greenkeeper, but it creates a file, and we take that Greenkeeper file, that Unity file, and what we call a splash image, which is just a fancy way of advertising our course inside the game, and we bundle that up into a zip file. That zip file is what gets distributed out to the players of the game, and for them to play it. But before we send it out to game, inside of Discord, there's a specific channel. Remember our Discord discussion called beta course discussions, and there's a beta channel where you post your beta up there. So put it in OneDrive, put it in Dropbox or whatever, and you post it up there for people to download and check out and run and make sure it works okay. And at that point, everyone says, hey, it runs great. Oh, no, you got to work on this. Seeing some performance issues. There's a bunch of other things that can go wrong, but the community is great at identifying those. At that point, you can make a decision whether, hey, this is good enough for me. I'm happy playing this course with my buddies on my own, and I'm done. And thank you very much. And that's perfectly fine. Or you can say, you know something, I did a really good job with this. I want to share it with the world, and I want to submit to publish. At that point, you send it into a gentleman on the Discord, and he takes a look at it. And there are some really, you're going to get some scrutiny. Let me put it that way. And it's good that we do that, because what we don't want to have to do is have a lot of suboptimal courses in game. We want to keep them at a certain caliber. That might change in the future, but just expect if you do that, it is going to be scrutinized a little bit. It's going to be looked at very closely for performance, what it looks like, whether you did certain things, the tree colors, there's a bunch of things, the way the grass looks, the shades, the textures. It's all going to be analyzed and say, hey, is this caliber enough to go inside of GSPro? And if so, then it gets published to GSPro and everybody sees your course. So that is at a high level how you build a course inside of the OPCD tools, and hopefully it gives you a good overview. And at this point, hopefully you'll continue on and you'll start getting into the more technical stuff.